Hello, guys. David Vose here. Oh, what a beautiful day it is, and I'm so happy to see this beautiful day. We've just had a beautiful week, and I'm a little worried that this is going to come to an end at some point, and we're going to have winter. But I hope you're having a wonderful day, guys. As you can hear, my voice is all scratchy, and I don't even know what you would call this kind of a voice, but I can barely, you know. I just don't like the way my voice is. It's probably going to be raspy. But I want to talk to you today. I had two subjects that I wanted to that's going on in my head. One of them is about omega-3s and diet and something I've learned that will blow everybody's mind. We have found the key, the elixir of life, but I'm going to save that for tomorrow. Because we're on this subject and I want to finish this. We're on the subject of Osiris and Isis and Nimrod and Semiramis and Shem killing Nimrod. And it's pretty interesting. And it's opened up a big old can of worms. And I think this is the way. We got ourselves a little screwdriver inside the lid. We're going to start prying on this thing and see if we can get it open. I have not done much research. As I say, I don't do any research. I really don't. I mean, very little. I don't read books or anything. But I pray and think, and I'm constantly thinking and praying. And the Lord just brings these things to me. And then I also have things that people send me. Because I'll be talking about a subject, and sometimes people will send me something that will really be something that is a beautiful jewel, little piece of information that fits with what I'm saying. And I'll be able to go down that rabbit trail. But it's not like I go to the library and start reading all these books or go online and start reading all these books. But a friend of mine sent me a couple of excerpts from some of the ancient writings. And what I've seen now, just from reading a few paragraphs and pages here, is I get a clearer understanding now of why we don't know anything. Now, I could just say, well, it was all burned in the Alexandrian library, and we don't have any of it today. They got rid of this information. But that would be too simplified. I mean, they didn't just burn the Alexandrian library. Every time a nation would take over, they'd go and destroy the wisdom of the nation prior. And it's almost as if they bring people down to their knees. You have plagues, war, famine, and they burn the cities and they burn everything down. They raze it to the ground. And then they start over and they become the heroes because they knew the information that these prior civilizations had. But the peasants will lose that information within a few years. I really wish my voice wasn't like this because I really want to tell you these things today. It's very important things that we want to talk about. But what I'm finding is, you know how we're finding out now that there were these big mega cities that appeared to be quite ornamental and beautiful and megalithic. Right here in America, I'll show you a picture here of ancient Chicago, which today we call Chicago. But originally there was a magnificent city there. And I'm not going to go into that today because we don't have time, but I've told you guys how I have determined that that city was the capital of this country at some point. And it's interesting because while we're on that point, there was a statue there in downtown Chicago that was later burned down, as well as St. Louis and all the other big cities were all burnt down before the 20th century. But it's kind of like the Statue of Liberty that we have. It sort of symbolizes what we stand for and bring your tired and your homeless and so forth. But not now. We've got problems. We can't afford it. But at that time, we had the Statue of Liberty. And it wasn't bring your terrorists. But anyway, I digress. In Chicago, they had another big statue. It wasn't quite as big as Statue of Liberty, but it was a big statue. And it was a woman, and she was holding up something, but it wasn't the torch. It was the Liberty, and she had this Phrygian cap. Interesting that Phrygian cap is so important to the people who lived here, right? And then the people who took over when they burned it down, they pretended they were into liberty too, like liberty and justice for all. And I believe that the Constitution was made by people of the true esoteric believers who knew about the true Phrygian cap and the true liberty, the natural law of nature that were under no other man-made laws. So the Statue of Liberty, I believe, is a good thing, and I think it goes back to some ancient mystery, which is what we're going to talk about. But this Phrygian cap is something I wanted to point out. It was a symbol for a long, long time. And it seems to be among the Tartarians. They seem to have something to do with it. But you could trace this thing back to Mary Magdalene in Marseille, France. But before that, where did it go? Like, why did Mary have this? Man, my voice must be very annoying, guys. I'm very sorry. But why did Mary rever this Phrygian cap? And where's Phrygia? And what is this all about? I want to take just a minute to show you something. The Phrygian civilization, it says in the Goggle Brothers AI, was an ancient kingdom in Anatolia, which is modern-day Turkey, that flourished in the 8th and the 7th centuries BCE. So before Christ, 800 years before Christ, there was a civilization called the Phrygian civilization up around Turkey. These are the ones, if you go down here, you'll see under culture, it says the Phrygians were known for their loud music, played on the aulos or double pipes. The Phrygian mode, or a scale of quarter tones, was popular with ancient Greece and Roman musicians. Phrygian art was influenced by Hittite art and went on to influence Etruscan art. Now, we've talked about the Etruscans. There was an area, Etruria or something, in central Italy. It was called the Etruscan area, where their kingdom was. But when they kind of disappeared and other kingdoms came up, the priests would continue to speak in this Etruscan language. We find that nobody seems to know how to speak the language. The peasants didn't know anything about it. They spoke Latin or some other Greek language or something in that area. But the Etruscan language was continued on in rituals and ceremonies. You find it on gravestones and religious ceremonies and things. So it appears that it was some kind of a holy language. When the kings and Caesars would go to their schools and preparations to become kings and leaders, their initiations and so forth, they were taught the Etruscan language. It held secrets, and it goes back to this Phrygian cap. Now, the Phrygian cap, like we said, was worn by everyone, but that's because the Magi, each of them had the Phrygian cap. It's the priesthood. That priesthood, when it went into other languages or other countries, wasn't always called the Magi, but it was the mysteries, and it was the same mysteries that spread throughout the world. So there were individuals who knew these truths, and they symbolized it by this Phrygian cap, the cap of liberty. We find it here in Chicago, and we find pictures of Chicago, or ancient Chicago before the Constitution, where Chicago was this massive city that had all of these symbolic artistic buildings, cathedrals, statues, waterways. And as we've said, they're not just buildings, they're temples, right? The Capitol building is a temple. They had built it in Rome, in this Etruscan area. The Capitol the building was built over a skull called Golgotha. And it seems to be some symbol of all of these ancient truths going all the way back to Noah. And we're going to look into some of these ancient stories because we've lost all these books. We don't really even know who Abraham was. We're going to show you that at the time of Christ and after 200 or 300 years, before the apostasy came in and they destroyed the library at Alexandria, the church fathers and other people knew about these things. And they write a little bit about it, and we just don't think about it or write about it or talk about it today. But if we would look into these things, we'd find that we can't just believe in our Christianity and our Old Testament and our teachings and our morals based on what some pastor or some lunatic told us 500 years ago, or based on tradition. We've got to go back and find out what was all this based on. Early Christian art, and continuing well into the Middle Ages, build on the same Greco-Roman perceptions of pseudo-Zoroaster and his Magi as experts in the arts of astrology and magic, and routinely depict the three wise men that follow the star with Phrygian caps. So, I believe people may not know this, but the three wise men, the Magi, are led by Daniel, the prophet, who I believe was the second Zoroaster. Because Daniel was over all the Magi, as it says in the book of Daniel. And they divided the entire world into three parts or divisions. And it was given to Shadrach, Meshach, and Abednego. Well, Shadrach, Meshach, and Abednego were the leaders or the governors of those satraps. And those satraps were, one was India, one was the southern area around Egypt and Babylon, and the other one was up in Europe. And those were the three divisions of the world. And so when the three wise men bowed down before Jesus, they were all children of the Exodus or the dispersion of Israel that was all over the world. And the world was broken into three parts. And the religion of the world was the religion of the Magi. And this cap represents liberty. So, we can go into that in another video. I think it's important to go into that because it may tell us a little bit more about who these people were that were here in America before the Constitution. They came over in about 1400 and they built grand cities in America. And it's all been burned and covered over. But the reason I talk about that is because the same thing evidently happened with all the information that we had about history in the days of Abraham and Shem, all we have is these little stories like Osiris and Isis, Nimrod and Semiramis, and in our Bible, Abraham and Shem. We know very little about these people and the things that they did. But this knowledge was not unknown to the people in the first century when they still had the Alexandrian library and all of the wise men that frequented the Alexandrian library. And even later at the library at Constantinople. And there were libraries in other various places. There's one down in Timbuktu in Africa, as we said the other day. But these libraries, many of them had a lot of this information. But in around 395, 380, 390, 400, the Goths took over Rome. The Lombards took Italy. They changed our Bible. They put out the Holy Flame and dismantled and discontinued the Holy Virgins, which is the Holy Priesthood. And one of the things that they did was they burned the Alexandrian library. I don't believe it was all destroyed. Some of the priests probably took these writings and put them underground in maybe even under the Great Pyramid, different places where they have these chambers, and they're hid. We know that there's another place where all of this information is hid here in America. And we've talked about that before. Somewhere in a mountain here, nearby where I'm at, there's a big cave under the ground, and all this information is hid down there. And I believe one day it'll all come back to light. So, in the this little article called The Trumpet, it says that scientist, astronomer, mathematician, and father of nations is talking about Abraham. But who knew he was an astronomer? Well, they knew that. Today, Christianity doesn't know anything about Abraham except for what it says in this little parable we've got written in our Bible. But what's happened is it's caused people today to believe that history is just some kind of his story. They don't know that what we call mythology today, maybe even biblical text, is telling us a real story that really happened. And men knew these stories. The only way they've come down to us is in these little parable myths. But it used to be that the wise men, the church fathers, and everyone that were historians or priests or anything, they talked about them. They wrote about them. They all knew who they were. There was no ambiguity. You'll be surprised to find out who Abraham really was and what the real story is that we've never been told as Christians in the last 2,000 years, or maybe 1,700 years. The fact that ancient records speak of scientists among the Chaldeans who had a special relationship with a mighty deity isn't coincidence. History records a man who lived 10 generations after the Great Flood, who used celestial science to prove the existence of deity. Now remember, this is written in a modern context with some false assumptions. We're going to have to overlook those false assumptions, because when somebody who's a devout Christian or a devout Muslim or a devout Buddhist or something reads history, they do read it through a lens. But we're not going to do that. We're going to unveil or reveal what was known in the past that you've not heard in a long time. It says that this wealthy and influential ruler became a key figure in the history of the ancient Austria. Austria? That's way up there in Europe. He was a skilled scientist. He was an astronomer and a mathematician. His astronomical discoveries shook the foundations of the Babylonian religion. He heavily influenced not only Austrian culture, but also Egyptian scientific thought. He led armies that altered the course of Assyrian history. This took place before he became the forefather of the Arab, Turk, and Israelite peoples. This man's name was Abraham. Yes, the astounding evidence of both biblical and secular history proves that the patriarch Abraham was not only real, he was a real person. He exerted a tremendous effect on the entire ancient world. Guys, I've been telling you this for a long time. Yes, the Bible's written in parables. Yes, the whole thing's a big parable. Yes, there are spiritual things and esoteric wisdom all throughout every word of that book. But still, our Bible tells us about our history, and it is literal. And these people that we read about in our Bibles are literal. The apostles weren't ignorant fools. They spoke of the great cloud of witnesses. Gideon to the apostle Silas was a true person, a real person, who held the Melchizedek priesthood, who was a Nazarite priest. Noah was a real person. Jesus said Noah was a real person. As it was in the days of Noah, so shall it be in the days of the Son of Man. So, we need then to know. I want to stop these individuals in their tracks who are running around, who have just recently learned some information, and now they're going to tear down the Bible and tell us that Jesus isn't coming again, or that maybe Jesus didn't even exist. It's all just mythology. Not now, friends. Not now. Not at the point that Jesus spoke of when he said the days are coming when men will no longer believe, and they'll go out and go and eat and drink with the confirmed drunkards and go back to the law and believe in government. They're believing in a beast, a false deity. They're idolaters. They don't believe in the true deity. And this is what Abraham was all about. And by faith, Abraham attained unto salvation because Abraham was a real person according to the book of Hebrews. And it says this influence is recounted in the writings of the Jewish historian Josephus, the Babylonian historian Vose, the Roman historian Eusebius, and the medieval Austrian chronicle. The Austrian chronicle is something that I've been meaning to do a video on, and I think I will here soon, but we're going to give you time to do that today. But before the philosophy of German rationalism took root, this is what we're under today. We're not empirical scientists anymore. We don't have to prove anything. We just rationalize everything. Darwinism, Freudism, Einsteinism, it's all rationalism. You can't prove that the stars are thousands of light years away. Okay, but we can rationalize that they are, but they're not. It's just rationalization. It's just lies. So before Germany and the Goths, because the Germans and the Goths are the same people, the Visigoths and the Ostrogoths and the Lombards and the Herlus, these Germanic tribes were what we would call the Goths. The dark castles, the barbarians, the Vikings, these are the Goths. And they became rationalists. They became atheists. They fell away. And this is where you get Nietzsche and Hegel and the Hegelian dialectic and all of this. This is where we get Darwin. It's atheism, rationalism. It took root in their education in the 19th century. Secular histories regarding biblical patriarchs were widely taught based on the records of Vose and other ancient historians. Many books were written by scholars in the 15th, 16th, 17th, and 18th centuries that recounted the lives of Noah, Shem, Nimrod, Abraham, Moses, and many others. These ancient records reveal that Abraham used mathematics and astronomy to discredit the pagan priesthood of his time and to prove the existence of the one true deity. Well, again, remember what I said, we're going to have to take this with a grain of salt. This is somebody's interpretation, but we're still going to learn a lot from this. Okay, because I'm not necessarily of the mind that Abraham was trying to teach some grand truth that all the priests of Babylon and Egypt were wrong. That's a misunderstanding. When we get into the identity of Nimrod and Shem and Abraham, we'll find this out. So that's not quite true. But it is true that Abraham was a great mathematician and an astronomer. Assyrio-Babylonian Empire. Abraham was born in the city of Ur, in the land of the Chaldees, sometime around the year 1996 BC. So 2,000 years BC. The city was then part of the world-ruling Assyrio-Babylonian Empire. While modern historians often downplay the impact of the old Assyrian-Babylonian Empire, the Roman historian Velius Paterculus lists this kingdom as the first world empire. Quoting an earlier source in the book Roman History, Paterculus writes, between the time when Rome conquered Macedonia and the beginning of the reign of Ninus, king of the Assyrians, who was the first to hold world power, lies an interval of 1995 years. Who's Ninus? Rome conquered Macedonia during the middle of the 2nd century before Christ. So King Ninus probably began his hold on world power sometime during the 22nd century BC before Christ. This was less than 200 years before Abraham's birth. Ninus is identified in the 1st century, the recognitions of Clement, as the biblical Nimrod. So this is a church father. We've known all of this, but we're not being taught Christian truth. We're being taught Christian deception. We've never even been told that there is any information about who really Nimrod was or what he did or who Abraham was. But the Bible records that Nimrod became the post-flood world's first emperor by protecting the people from wild animals and gathering them into cities such as Babel, Erech, and Akkad. Now, already we have to point this out. The first world ruler was a black man. Isn't that interesting? A son of Ham. Now, how do we know he was black? Well, maybe he wasn't. We don't really know. But I will tell you this. What we've learned and what we've taught and what we've told everybody all these centuries is that the black race came from Ham. It could be that the black race came from a white man. If Ham was Noah's son and Noah was white, then how did he have a black child? Well, remember, Noah was married to Cain's great-great-granddaughter, or Naamah. Now, if Cain was black, then maybe Naamah was black. But how is it that if Cain was black, he always gets the short end? Why is he always the bad guy? Do we know if Abel was white? We don't know. So all of this is just speculation, and you have to understand that whoever Adam and Eve were, they were the father of every living child on the earth. So every race, according to the book of Acts, came from Adam and Eve. I doubt whether the Lord made Adam one color and Eve the other color. As time went on, people moved and they went to different places and locations. And when the children of Ham went south into Africa, they were obviously in an area where there was more sunlight. So some believe that over centuries, they developed through the survival of the fittest and sort of this evolutionary thing that began to happen. People that were very light-skinned ended up dying off in Africa quite quickly because they couldn't handle the sun. And therefore, the genetic stock became darker and darker. This could very well be. We do find a lot of white people in the northern countries where there's a lot of snow. We find polar bears in the polar regions and dark brown or dark black bears in areas where it doesn't snow as much. So this is certainly possible. I don't think there is such a thing as racism, friends. There are families and there are tribes, but we all come from the same source. So, whatever the case or however his skin was colored, Nimrod, the son of Ham, was the ruler of the world, the first, basically, empire ruler of the world. And he had quite a big area to reign. He reigned over the cities of Babel, Erech, and Akkad. This biblical passage also records that Asher, forefather of the Assyrians, went out of Babel and founded Nineveh. As the context of these verses indicates, however, it was Nimrod who led Asher out of Babel and who actually supervised the construction of Nineveh, the city of Ninus. Greek historian Diodorus of Sicily wrote his Bibliotheca Historica sometime between 60 and 30 BC. He records that Ninus and his wife Semiramis ruled an empire stretching from Libya to the borders of India. So now you know why. In India, they have such an ancient culture, because it was the first world empire and it stretched all the way to India and to northern Africa. And you would have to say all of the Middle East. Yet they rebelled against deity and set up a pagan religion based on the worship of the sun and the fiery serpent associated with it. Well, that's his point of view. I don't believe they did that. I believe they had a priesthood that was made by Enoch before the flood and was handed down to the children and was taught by Nimrod, as Nimrod and Semiramis taught everyone these mysteries. And we had time, we could prove this in every detail. But we're going to prove it, but we're going to do it in a very quick and methodical manner here today. But as we read the other day, in the two Babylons, and we're going to see that here again, Alexander Hislop says that all the religions of the world came from Nimrod. And Nimrod was this great Messiah king, and his wife Semiramis was the Holy Virgin Mother. And in other cultures, they call her different things like Inanna, Ishtar. We call her Easter today, or Astarte, or Isis, as she was known in Egypt. And Nimrod was known as Osiris. But as we read the other day, Shem killed Nimrod. We also read that Set killed Osiris. And we're going to find out that there's another guy who killed somebody and did the same thing with cutting people up. Yeah, Zeus and Kronos. And we're going to get into that because we have to understand that all these nations had the same story. And that story is about something that we're being lied to about. We're being told that Satan, Set, was the bad guy and Osiris is the good guy. Of course, as I said, Christians don't believe in Osiris either because that's pagan, because it's from Egypt. But it's in our Bible, Shem and Nimrod. Christians today, they've gone back to Judaism. They no longer follow the Christian teachings, which is the pagan virgin birth story. And in the pagan virgin birth story, the virgin birth is Semiramis, and the savior is Nimrod, the mighty hunter. It's actually in our Bible, but we take it from the point of view of looking at the Joker, the fool who goes through the wheel of rebirth around and around, or the carnal flesh, Jacob. You are worm, O Jacob, Yahweh says to him. And we see that Jacob struggled with the law of Moses and with war and the laws of genocide and rape for thousands of years until Christ came and said, your deity is the devil. So, for those of you who haven't watched any of the videos that we do here, that's going to come as quite a shock. But please don't go quickly away and assume that what we're saying is false. stay tuned and dig deep and think about what we're saying and pray about it. Because there's a lot to learn, and we need to learn the truth. In order to learn the truth, we're going to have an open mind, because a lot of what we've been told is false. So, Babylonian mystery religion, the pagan Babylonian priesthood. Okay, pagan, it just means a nation. Babylon was one of the nations. So yes, it was pagan. It wasn't Judean. Judah hadn't even come along yet. He was still in the loins of Abraham. So this guy named Nimrod had a holy garment that was stolen by Esau. That was that birthright that Jacob stole. Where did Nimrod get it? Well, all of the Apocrypha, all of the ancient history says Nimrod was given that by Father Noah, and it was something that was handed down from Adam to Noah. And so it was the holy priesthood. And Nimrod had that holy priesthood. Yes, it did eventually go to Jacob, but Jacob stole it. And it's been breached. And this is why we always have these stories of Cain and Abel, Esau and Jacob, the two sons, the two priesthoods, the two lines that's come down to us today. So they taught the masses to believe that the sun, the moon, the stars, and the planets were gods. And that's not true. They didn't teach that. Nimrod taught the true astrology, the true science. And in fact, Abraham worked for Nimrod. And Nimrod sent Abraham to the West to further the teachings of this astrology. So I'm correcting some of the things that's being said here. He's just saying these things off the top of his head. A true wise person would need to read these things carefully and interpret them correctly and divide the words correctly. If Nimrod was evil and taught something very evil, then Abraham would not have been working for him. Now, there's many stories about how Terah had all these false deities. Idolatry. He had these little idols. And Abraham taught his father Terah and his brother Nahor that this was idolatry. And so we have proof that this is true. But not because Nimrod was an idolater. Nimrod was a mighty king, a king priest. And it was either him or it was Shem or Ham or one of those individuals that was the great Melchizedek of that priesthood. If Nimrod wasn't Melchizedek, then he was the son of, or the one that was in line that received the priesthood from Melchizedek. However, it began to degenerate into idolatry. And it was actually Abraham's father that was the idolater. And perhaps this is telling us that at that time, many did not understand these mysteries, and they became idolaters. So Abraham then became an astronomer and a mathematician and a philosopher, and he began to study these sciences, and he learned the truth about them. Semiramis was identified with the planet Venus, while Nimrod was honored as the sun deity. Well, you have to understand, in the New Testament, Jesus is as the sun that goeth forth on his chariot and goes across the sky, as it talks about in Psalms. Is Jesus the sun God? Well, no, because there is no God or deity that is a big round ball of light. But in fact, light itself is the divine being, but it's that light that's in all, through all, and above all. And the aperture of that light is your brain, or is the higher consciousness. And so it's mixed with a lot of symbolism. And there were those who couldn't grasp the symbolism, just as today people can't grasp. Or there might be math and physics that people cannot grasp. And they may misunderstand physics, and they may not even know the true science. But the worst you could call them is idolaters, or the least is that they're just the ignorant and the vulgar. So these priests used their knowledge of astronomy to predict the movements of the heavenly bodies, deceiving the masses into thinking they could communicate with the deities. Well, that's what it says in Israel Smith Clare, The Standard History of the World, Volume 1. Was it exactly that way? Did they deceive the masses? Perhaps. If that priesthood had fallen and they were trying to hide the mysteries, then that could be the case. As Nimrod and Semiramis expanded their kingdom, they ran into opposition from Noah's son Shem. An ancient tradition relates that the apostates who joined the rebellion of Nimrod made war against Shem and his followers. Shem is said to have obtained the aid of 72 Egyptian noblemen. As we said the other day, the word noblemen must mean like senators or certain rulers in the council of the divine, which was always a council of 72. If you notice that this council was in Egypt. Now, you might think, well, wait a minute, I thought Nimrod was ruling over the council. Well, remember, the kingdom of Nimrod, who ruled over Babylon, was a mighty empire that was stretching all around the world. They may have had a council in Egypt. They may have had one in Babylon. And there were brothers. And there was the leader of the Babylonians and the leader of the Egyptians. They were all brothers. Today we look back and we think, oh, well, these were just different nations and they hated each other. No, if Shem ruled over here and his brother Japheth ruled over there and Ham ruled over here, well, that was one family. Those three men were brothers. They together ruled the world. But when you went to the Sanhedrin, you gave an oration, you gave a talk, you had to convince the other members of the council that you were right, and they would slam down their gavel, and that would be the law. The Sanhedrin is the only heavenly authority that ever was, and wherever there is a Sanhedrin, that is the authority upon earth. The 72 deities that rule over the world are the 72 nations. And they would have, in every nation, they would have a council made up of 72 from each of the tribes. Just as the 12 tribes have 12 members, the apostles, that rule over each of the 12 tribes. There are 12 members or rulers that sit upon 12 thrones that rule over the 12 tribes. Well, the 72 came out of the loins of Jacob, meaning that wherever the world was, they came from the physical and they came from the spiritual. We have the higher concepts, we have the lower concepts. And Jacob represented the governmental aspect, the lower carnal nature of the beast. Yahweh, the avenger, the lawgiver. But there was the higher esoteric wisdom that was being taught by Enoch and in the higher priesthood. And not all of the vulgar understood those teachings. And sometimes the vulgar, through brute force, would take over. And they would conquer the world under the banner of the old carnal nature, an eye for an eye and a tooth for a tooth. But the wise men would be like prophets, and they would send out prophecies and say, oh, you're doing wrong. You must come back in line and soften your power with wisdom and gain the initiation into the mysteries. And so the great ones like Alexander the Great and Caesar and Nimrod, they knew the mysteries and they were adepts and they ruled with love and goodness. But we have a story that there was some kind of war. It's in our Bibles where Abraham fought Chedorlaomer, king of Elam, and Amraphel, right? This was a world war between Abraham and these other Babylonian nations. It's in our Bible like that. But at times that war was continuing. It started with Shem and Nimrod and it continued on down with Abraham. And Abraham had a battle with Amraphel. Well, that is another way of, in some nation, how they said Nimrod. So remember, Nimrod lived 215 years. And Terah, Abraham's father, lived 205. So this goes on down. Shem started the war. Abraham continued with the war. Who was on the good side and who was on the bad side? Was Shem correct? And Nimrod was wrong, because we're going to find out that Shem killed Nimrod and cut up all of his body into pieces. The way the story goes by Judeans is that he did a good thing because Nimrod was an idolater. But in the story of Egypt, Seth's the bad guy, and he kills Osiris and cuts up his body into many pieces. So in Egyptian, Seth is the bad guy, and Osiris is the good guy. But Osiris is the same as Nimrod. So we're going to have to weed this story out and figure out who's telling the truth. So it says, after Shem killed Nimrod, he had his body cut into pieces, and the pieces sent to various areas as a warning against idolatry. That's Alexander Hislop, the two Babylons, as we pointed out the other day. Shem's actions, however, only temporarily halted the spread of idolatry, as Herbert W. Armstrong noted in The Mystery of the Ages. Now we get a glimpse of the point of view that we're reading here. We're seeing this through the lens of several thousand years gone by. And a man named Herbert W. Armstrong, who wants to go back to the law of Moses and keep all the holy days and keep the Sabbath and deny the deity of Jesus Christ, an apostate, writes a book called The Mystery of the Ages, and he says that Shem had every right to kill Nimrod because he was an idolater. But that idolatry didn't get completely destroyed. It continued on, and there continued this battle. If you go on down, it says, in the province of Samaria, Semiramis was worshipped as the goddess Inanna, the morning and the evening star. As we pointed out the other day, our Bible tells us that Jesus is the morning star. So, do we really know what we're saying when we're talking about all this stuff? Did Herbert W. Armstrong know what he was talking about? Should we really go back to the law of Moses? Or was it, as Jesus said, your father, talking to the Jewish Sanhedrin, which was authorized by the Lord, and many of the Jewish Sanhedrin believed in Jesus, but many of them did not. And that was the end of their reign. They fell. And Jesus said, not one stone will be left upon a stone, and your house will be left unto you desolate. And that Sanhedrin perished after 70 AD because of what they did, because they crucified the Lord and Savior Jesus Christ. So after 2,000 years, people come up. They don't understand the Bible. They don't understand what astrology is. And they've not been told who Abraham is. They've not been told who Shem really was, or Nimrod, and Osiris in Egypt. These stories just seem like pagan mythologies to them. And they are misunderstanding all of history because they thought that Judaism and all the commandments of Moses was the right way to go, when in fact that was a parable about the wrong way to go, the lower ego and judgment and curses and hate. But instead, Jesus, born of the Virgin, condemned them and their religion. Now it says that Nimrod was called Tamuzi, a deity who was a precursor of Babylonian Tammuz. We find Ezekiel, the prophet, talking about Israelites weeping for Tammuz. And it offended Yahweh very much, because Tammuz was the son of Semiramis, or the Babylonian Inanna, Ishtar. But there in Ezekiel it also talks about how they would offer up their drink offerings to the Queen of Heaven. So you see, whatever this was, this, what we're calling the nation's religion, or the pagan religion, it was the worship of a woman and a pantheon. They had the father of the deities, they had the mother, the divine father, the divine mother. Usually it was the sky father and the earthly mother, or Mother Earth. And the Mother Earth was a virgin and gave birth to this child because Father Heaven died and she was left by herself to resurrect her husband. And she did so by fertility and rebirth. And it was a story, a beautiful story of fertility and rebirth that Christianity has now forgotten and has been told is anathema. And this is why most Christians today, like Herbert Armstrong, Jehovah's Witnesses, and Adventists, and all these Protestants that have been learning from them, has completely ruled out Christmas and has ruled out Easter as pagan and evil, and have turned back again to the law. As the Apostle Paul says, ye who want to be under the law, do you not read the law? It is slavery. And the apostles in Acts chapter 15, they met at the other Sanhedrin at Heliopolis. We've talked about that. Josephus says that they rebuilt Jerusalem in Heliopolis. And that was a Sanhedrin made up of the 72 that Jesus chose. And at that time, they came together and decided and told the world, we are not under law, but we are under grace. So according to the list of Assyrian kings that Sextus Julius Africanus recorded in his early 3rd century AD Chronographia, Nimrod's father Cush ruled 55 years. Nimrod ruled 52 years after his father's death, and Semiramis ruled 42 years after Nimrod's death. Did you know that in the Nazarite priesthood, women could become high priests and kings? And they would reign and they would rule. And this is why we have Deborah, the mother of Israel, before they began to go off and follow the lower carnal nature of the law of Moses. But she was of that lineage, Deborah, in the line of the Nazarite priests. And this is why Semiramis ruled for 42 years after Nimrod's death. Taking into account evidence of joint reign between Nimrod and Cush, it becomes evident that Abraham was likely born around the end of the reign of Empress Semiramis. Empress? Yes. Cestius of Cnidus, a Greek physician in the court of the Persian king Artaxerxes II, records that Semiramis was killed in a palace coup led by her son Ninus after she returned from a failed invasion of India. This was the political climate into which Abraham was born. Now consider the record of the ancient Babylonian historian Vose. In the 10th generation after the flood, there was among the Chaldeans a man, a righteous and great one, and skillful in the celestial sciences. While Berosus doesn't give this great scientist his name, the 1st century Jewish historian Josephus tells us Berosus was writing about Abraham, the same man recorded by the Bible. Josephus mentions that the Greek historian Hectaeus of Abdera wrote an entire book of the accomplishments of Abraham. Since Hectaeus was a scholar during the time of the Ptolemaic dynasty in Egypt, it can be assumed that his book on Abraham was lost when the Royal Library of Alexandria was burned. Yes, this is what we were talking about. A lot of this knowledge was lost when that happened. There is even an ancient Jewish hymn cited by Clement of Alexandria, a church father, about a certain unique man, an offshoot from far back of the race of the Chaldeans. Quote, this man was, quote, knowledgeable about the path of the star and how the movement of the sphere goes around the earth. Around the earth? This is quotes, both in circular fashion, but each on its own axis. Interesting. Globalism all the way back then. The poem related that the scientist of the Chaldeans was the only man of his era to see Zeus, the ruler of mortal men. Oh my goodness, who is this Zeus? Shall we dare find out? Of course, ancient Greek poets tended to call them, or the chief deity of any religion, by the name Zeus. The fact that this poem speaks of a Chaldean scientist who had a special relationship with the mighty deity isn't coincidence. The 4th century Roman historian Eusebius, another Christian father, cited an earlier source by a man named Eupolemus concerning the Jews of Assyria. Quoting this source, Eusebius says Abraham surpassed all men in nobility and wisdom, who was also the inventor of astronomy and the Chaldaic art, and pleased deity well by his zeal towards religion. Unquote. As a young man, Abraham determined to renew and to change the opinion of all men happened then to have concerning deity, for he was the first that ventured to publish this notion that there was but one deity, the creator of the universe, according to Josephus. So Abraham was teaching the people of Chaldea about the one true creator. Well, who could that be? Well, was he saying that Jesus wasn't divine, though but a man? Or was he saying that it was the divine that was in Jesus and that the Father and I are one? That is something that many people have failed to understand. The fight against paganism. The pagan priesthood established by Nimrod and Semiramis was teaching the masses to believe that the sun, the moon, the stars, the planets were manifestations of the deities. Well, many of them may have been. We find this in the New Testament where Paul says they were worshiping the sun and the moon and the stars. And four-footed creatures. What are these four-footed creatures that they were worshiping? Well, it was certainly astrology, wasn't it? Does this make astrology wrong? No, because Abraham was an astrologer and so was Daniel. What they didn't do is worship stars. They didn't worship the sun and the moon and the stars, but they taught the truth about them. They were divine powers, but they were called almost like angels, like we would say angels today, or they would certainly be dominions and lordships and thrones, but they weren't the divine being. And anyone who had gone through the initiation knew this. It wasn't Nimrod that didn't know this. It was the world that was falling into this apostasy because we're all living here in this world and we're all couldn't get along, and we ended up apostatizing from this great spiritual truth and following after the law of Moses or the law of Hammurabi or government or the beast. In addition to being a scientist, however, Abraham was a great teacher. He taught the people physics and mathematics and showed them that the celestial bodies moved according to preordained laws. Josephus paraphrases Abraham's words, if these bodies, now this is what Josephus says, quote, that Abraham says. And Abraham's words were, if these bodies had power of their own, they would certainly take care of their own regular motions. But since they do not preserve such regularity, they make it plain that insofar as they cooperate to our advantage, they do it not of their own abilities, but as they are subservient to him that commands them, to whom alone we ought justly to offer our honor and thanksgiving. Unquote. Well, I agree wholeheartedly with Abraham. But you see, he's not saying, oh, these powers, some think they're the ultimate power. No, that's not what they did. What some people thought was that they were bound in this world to these powers and authorities. They certainly do have influence over us. But these spirits were the divine pleroma of spirits. And they were all within us. And it was the grand revelation that Abraham was looking forward to, which was Christ, which the fullness of deity dwelleth in Christ. He was the Son of the living deity, the crowning of the creation, fully divine and fully man. Not idolatry at all, not worshiping all these powers individually or one against the other, but the man being the great ruler, having dominion over the animals of the zodiac or the zoo or the paradise. You see, this is the subtle truth here. And that people, when they saw these things like astrology, they began to be idolaters, worshiping these powers as gods. By the same manner, Christianity has seen these stories, and they have begun to trivialize them and make them into very simple matters, not fully grasping the esoteric meaning. Wasn't that people worship the powers of the heavens, but that they didn't worship the truth and the truth alone, and they didn't know that these powers were subject to us, that the demons were subject to men. So what got started with Abraham and was carried on down, which is the promise that was given to Abraham, that in his seed all the world would be blessed, which was Christ. We have, by the apostles' teachings, this great truth. Abraham taught the Chaldeans what the priests secretly knew. They did secretly know. The movement of the stars and other heavenly bodies are one of the greatest proofs of deity's existence. The presence of law demands the presence of a lawgiver. Okay? As perhaps the most famous scientist in the land of the Chaldeans, Abraham declared the stars and planets were only physical objects created by the one true deity. As trumpet manager-editor Joel Hilliker writes in our Awesome Universe Potential, this is the trumpet, so we're reading from a religious document here, their ideas, but I think it's interesting to see their point of view. What is most certain is that Abraham's scientific knowledge came through his connection with the creator deity, the one source powerful enough to create stars, galaxies, and suns and moons, planets brilliant enough to set them all in order according to the perfect laws, and loving enough to teach those laws. What many historians are unwilling to admit is that Abraham possessed advanced astronomical knowledge that would not be rediscovered for thousands of years. Yet Josephus further records that Abraham wasn't the first astronomer in the family. The study of astronomy originated in the family line of Seth, the third son of Adam. He wrote that deity gave those who lived before the flood such long life that they might perfect those things which they had invented in astronomy. So you see, astrology and astronomy and this knowledge went back to Adam. It wasn't false knowledge. We just have to understand the truth about it. Other ancient records indicate that Noah had knowledge of the maritime astronomy involving navigating by the stars. This noble and elderly patriarch likely brought knowledge of mathematics, astronomy, and other sciences from one side of the flood to the other, passing it down from generation to generation to Abraham, father of the faithful. According to the Biblical Companion, a Bible study and published by William Carpenter in 1836, the idolatrous worship introduced by Semiramis didn't obtain great ascendancy in Assyria till the days of her grandson Arioch. Well, you see, that was according to some guy in 1836. But what we have to understand is he wasn't understanding this correctly. Semiramis didn't start some false religion. She's the Holy Virgin Mother. She had the holy garment that was given to her by a long succession of women from Eve. The astrology wasn't false. It became idolatry later on. And so the grandson Arioch, king of Eliezer, Abraham would spend most of Arioch's 30-year reign fighting against his idolatrous worship. It tells you that in Genesis chapter 14. As the pagan priests of the Assyro-Babylonian Empire gained power and influence, they lost patience with Abraham and his teachings about the one true deity. Drove Abraham, who was literally once a high priest for Nimrod, who worshipped in the temple with Nimrod. But now the great religion of Nimrod, Semiramis, was being taught by the great priesthood holder Abraham to go forth and teach more correctly that which was originally taught by Nimrod and Semiramis and handed down from Adam and Eve. Josephus records that the Chaldeans and other peoples of Mesopotamia raised a tumult against Abraham, forcing him to flee the country. Unlike the priests of the Babylonian mystery religion, Abraham refused to teach lies to receive the praise of men. These pagan religions leaders would have killed Abraham for publishing the truth and likely killed his brother Haran. They did kill his brother Haran. The Bible only records that Haran died before his father Terah in the land of his nativity, in Ur of the Chaldees. Josephus adds that a monument was erected in Haran's honor and that Terah hated Chaldea on account of his mourning for Haran. While Terah himself fell into idol worship, so we find this story in the Apocrypha where Abraham tried to teach his father Terah not to be an idolater. And the idols that were left by Terah ended up in the hands of people. And even in the days, ended up in the hands of Laban, who was the son of Haran, another brother of Abraham. And it says that Abraham's two wives took these teraphim, or these idols that Terah had, perhaps called teraphim because they were from Terra. And these were taken down and were used in some kind of manner by Rael, and her son Joseph, who had this divination that he used, and this golden cup that he used for divination, and these teraphim that he planted in Benjamin's saddlebag in order to see his father again. And that's another long story. But what I'm telling you is that these idols were handed down, idolatrous or not. Terah's idols were given to Rachel and then to Joseph and became part of the religion of Joseph in Egypt. So what is going on here? It's certainly not what Herbert W. Armstrong believes. And we'll get to the answer of that. If we're not elucidating it now, we will get to the answer of it soon. To recount all the various histories of the things Abraham suffered during his period would fill many pages. He fought in battle against the feudal lord of the land of Alagomorum and lost. He was driven from his country and for a long time fell into poverty. He wandered with his followers along the banks of the Danube River. The Danube? Huh? The Danube's up in Europe, isn't it? Until he came to the edge of the known world, there in the alpine valleys of Europe. He helped found one of the most sophisticated cultures of the ancient world. Then, in the course of time, he returned to Chaldea to connect with the family he had to leave behind. I can imagine what this Herbert Armstrong publication is trying to get across here, because I'm aware of the fact that they teach British Israelism and the fact that the Caucasians came from the people of Israel when they were scattered and they went over the Caucasus Mountains. And when they got to Austria, they found that it had already been established true worship. And this is what he's talking about. This is why I want to go into the Austrian Chronicles in another video. There's certainly mention of all the... We talked about one of these chronicles that we mentioned the other day that traces the kings and queens of Europe back to Abraham and then back all the way to Adam. So through his trials and tribulations, however, Abraham stayed faithful to his belief in deity until when he was 75 years old, deity himself actually appeared to Abraham and made a covenant with him that would change the course of history. Abraham knew more about the stars than any man of his era, so deity made him a promise that if he continued to obey the one true creator deity, his descendants would be more numerous than the stars. I think what he was actually saying, if you're looking at the parable, that's what it says. But what's actually going on is the true creator, which is the Holy Divine Spirit within Abraham, that through and by means of the Holy Spirit taught him all things, because you need no man to teach you, but the Holy Spirit will teach you all things you need to know. In the hour, you need to know it. Because you see, the Holy Spirit's been gradually teaching these things, first in prophecies and revelations, but as mysteries until they were revealed by the apostles and prophets, and will be fully revealed by the Holy Spirit, as Jesus says, in each and every one of us. So what's happening here is the creator, the true creator, is the mind, the higher mind, and we don't worship idols. But you'll never be able to get the world to stop being a materialistic world. It's a revelation, and every man must catch that revelation through the classroom that we're living in. Most of this amazing history is actually corroborated in secular sources. Yet, deity summarizes what is most vital for us to be known about Abraham in the pages of the Bible. So James chapter 2, verse 23 states, "And the scripture was fulfilled which saith, Abraham believed in deity. He believed in that inner higher power within him. And it was imputed unto him for righteousness, and he was called the friend of deity." Very interesting. Now, let me show you this. Thanks to a friend of mine who sent this to me. We're going to get to some of the bottom of this deep knowledge. We're going to go to Judges chapter 19. This is the NIV. He said to her, "Get up, let's go." but there was no answer. Then the man put her on his donkey and set out for home. When he reached home, he took a knife and cut up his concubine, limb by limb, into 12 parts, and sent them into all the areas of Israel. Everyone who saw it was saying to one another, "Such a thing has never been seen or done, not since the days the Israelites came up out of Egypt." This is long after Set cuts up Osiris and cuts him into little pieces. This is long after Shem kills Nimrod and cuts him up into little pieces. This is after they had, in the book of Judges, when they were going into the promised land and dividing up the land of Canaan for themselves, for the 12 tribes. And this horrifying, hideous thing happens. A man takes a knife and cuts up his concubine, limb by limb, into 12 parts. Now, it's interesting because in Egypt, Set cuts up Osiris into 14 parts. And it's said that this has to do with the fact that there are 14 days that the moon is waning and 14 days that it waxes. And altogether, there's 28 days. And it's something to do with that when the sections of the moon, as it goes from the crescent to the full moon, and it's these 14 divisions. So it's astrology. Well, now here we've got 12. Cuts her up into 12 parts. Well, you might imagine in your mind what that means. The 12 houses of the zodiac is cut into 12 houses. So all of this is about astrology. But now, what were they talking about when they said, this has never happened before, not since the day that the Israelites came up out of Egypt? So it had happened once before, but in Egypt. What's he talking about? Take a look. Shem had Nimrod's body cut to pieces and had the pieces sent out over the world as a grim warning to those who would defy deity of heaven. Nimrod's death was one of the most violent ever suffered by man. Huh? You know, that reminds me of Jesus' death. And we all say that it was one of the worst deaths suffered by man. An ignominious death. He died for us. Do you know there's stories about Jesus' body being broken for us in the New Testament? And how many pieces was his body broken into? 12. For there were 12 apostles. Oh, man. I know. My voice. I'm sorry, guys. But let's go on. In the 19th chapter of Judges, we read that a Levite took a knife and cut the body of his concubine into 12 pieces and sent the parts into all the coasts of Israel. Nothing like it had been done or seen from the day that the children of Israel came up out of the land of Egypt. Where did that Levite get that idea of cutting a body to pieces and sending his parts throughout the land? The idea had come down to him through the patriarchs, and they had got it from the case of Shem and Nimrod. And how does Hislop reach his conclusion? Osiris, as has already been pointed out, has been unquestionably identified with Nimrod. Osiris died a violent death, so violent that nothing like it was ever heard of in Egypt. His body was cut to pieces, and the pieces were scattered throughout the world. Shem is identified with Typho, who was the evil one. Well, Typho is identified with Apollyon, the destroyer, the storm deity as well. He had such influence over the conspirators as to be able to put to death so great a deity as Osiris and cut his body to pieces. Now, mind you, Set is where we get the Greek Saturn, or today we call him Satan. So Osiris, who was also Nimrod, was killed by Satan. But in the Hebrew story, Nimrod, the good guy that was cut up into pieces like the body of Christ, born of the Virgin, was cut into pieces by Shem. Shem, who as of the lineage of Set. I know. I'm sorry, friends. It must be very difficult to hear this. But you must understand that the truth will set you free. If you want to be free, then please listen carefully and receive the love of the truth, that you might be saved and delivered from the wrath that's coming. One of the most fascinating and profitable of all studies. In the first place, we know that behind all the deities and images, there is the grand original. We know, for example, that Nimrod's wife was the first queen of heaven. We know that she and Nimrod were the grand original of the Madonna and Child. Huh? Do you understand, friends, what we're saying here? Did you know that the Madonna is the Holy Virgin Mother Mary? Remember, they were always black, the black Madonna, and her little child in her lap, who is Jesus. Now, let me show you this. As we said, as my friend reminds me, the body of Christ was broken into 12 pieces and given one piece each to the 12 apostles. It is our migration through the wheel of rebirth. We're cut up into pieces. We go through each of the 12 houses. Now, this, what we call the 12 houses or the wheel of rebirth, is a round sphere. And on your screen, you will see a sphere such as this. Notice that in the middle of that sphere is a cross. And under the cross is these three letters, IHS. Well, this was something that they used to have in Egypt. You notice as Christians, we eat the little cross buns for Easter. And above Christ's head, there's always this halo, and it's always IHS. It's a continuation of this practice from Egypt. But Herbert Armstrong and many other Protestants would say, oh, because the church fell and became apostate. Well, what were they really doing, and why were they doing it? The communion in Egypt, a religion that was practiced there in Egypt for 200 years, as we've been talking about here on this channel, which was what John the Baptist was doing down in Heliopolis, beyond the River Jordan, at the house of Bethany, or Beth House of On. Heliopolis is often in Greek spelled the city of On. It was the city of John. And at Heliopolis, they had a particular religion. Just as we've said, this religion is in one form or another all around the world. And the sacrament was something that was carried out by Abraham with Melchizedek. And this religion was spread by Abraham and others all around the world. And in Egypt, it was called Serapis Christ. Serapis Christ. And they did this for more than 200 years. But on the wafer, there was written IHS, which is Isis, Horus, Seb. Isis, Horus, Seb. This is an Egyptian teaching that goes back to the Great Pyramid with the empty tomb of Osiris. And Osiris had two sisters, Mary and Myrti. That's in our Bible as Lazarus or Lazarus, who had two sisters, Mary and Martha. Well, just something to think about, friends. I'm going to go ahead and go. I hope you guys have a wonderful evening. I hope my throat heals overnight and gets better so we can do a video that's not so obnoxious tomorrow. So we'll see you guys tomorrow. Lord will bless you. Have a good one.